All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Today, I'm joined by Bob Ludke, the co-founder of Value Inclusion and author of Transformative Markets, as well as more recently, case studies in disability-driven innovation. He has had a diverse career that has spanned multiple industries and occupations, so he brings a wealth of experience and expertise on the topics that we'll cover today. Bob, thanks for joining me this morning.
It is my pleasure, Brendan. I'm really excited to be here.
So before we get into all of the topics that you have recently written about and case studies, I want to talk about maybe the journey that got you there. So could we talk about your childhood or your first exposure to disability and kind of whether it was a firsthand experience or something that you just learned about that kind of got you on this career path?
Yeah. So I was born with a disability. I was born with a dislocated right hip. And I don't know if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, but I wore the boots with the iron bar between the boots, just like Forrest Gump did when he was little, in an effort to get my hip healed. And while it worked some, it certainly didn't fully address the nature of my hip. And so I spent virtually my entire life with the after effects of being born with a dislocated hip. And so, my posture was always a little bit off. I couldn't play contact sports because I had curvature of the spine. I had a lot of back trouble, a lot of back pain, things like that. But, every time my parents would take me to a physician and mind you, I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, which has, I believe, still the country's largest teaching hospital, right? So we had access to very, very sophisticated medical care, and no one could help. Like no one could, provide any path forward to how I could kind of rehabilitate myself. And it was just, being told time and again that, oh, you're going to have messed up back. You're going to be in a lot of pain your whole life. And so it's one of those injuries where I think, if I had been born with it today, or even in the last 20, 25 years, like physical therapy would have taken care of it. I mean, it's just so much more sophisticated now. And so I have done over the last 25, 30 years, a lot of physical therapy to address the imbalances in my body. And I've made a lot of progress in that. But, my gait at times can still be a little off. My right leg is smaller than my left, especially my right calf. But it's a disability that in a way has made me more focused on my physical health, my physical well-being. I remember after a surgery about 15 years ago, a doctor told me, like, if you stop moving, your body's going to fall apart. And so that has always been a constant reminder for me to, continue to maintain a focus on my health, my physical well-being, strength in important areas, things like that. So, I think like a lot of people with disabilities, I've learned to use the disability as a way to make myself better than I otherwise would have been.
Yeah. As a kid, did you identify as being disabled, or was it kind of physically, did it manifest physically enough that it ostracized you from other kids, or was it not really something that people were aware of?
Very, very few people were aware of it. And what really wasn't something talked about. And again, I grew up in a great family, loving family. But, when you go to, again, very sophisticated visits or visits with very sophisticated medical professionals, and they tell you there's not much they can do about it, after a while, you just start moving on from it. And so it really hasn't been until the last 5 or so years when I've become more involved in issues around disability employment that I've taken the time to look back on, the previous 50 years of my life. And it's been an important realization for me because I realize how much it actually impacted my life, my physical well-being, my emotional well-being, because I was in pain a lot of times. And when you're young and you're in pain, that's a hard thing to deal with. And so I was never ostracized, but there was that time when you're a teenager and you go from being pretty good in sports to really having trouble because your body's just not working like it used to. And, but you can't really provide an explanation for that. Like, I didn't know how to explain all of this. And so I wouldn't say, again, I wasn't ostracized, but I certainly lost a lot of self-confidence. And, um,
Yeah.
there are times that I kind of withdrew from that because I just didn't know what to do.
As an adolescent and a young adult, what were you particularly interested in?
Oh, I like the kind of the traditional sports that, most kids in the Midwest like to play. I played soccer, basketball, baseball growing up. Um, but but it was really, I think, freshman year basketball when the practices, the expectations start to get more intense. That I just couldn't. I couldn't do it anymore. And the coach offered to keep me on the team, but I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. What about career aspirations and academically? Was there a specific topic or career that you kind of envisioned pursuing?
Oh, all my life, I have loved history, in particular American history. And I went to college. I went to Marquette University, and I think we'll come back to Marquette in a bit. But I went to Marquette, um, fully intending to get a PhD in history and be a university professor like my dad. And um, when I got to Marquette, I plowed through all the history courses. I loved them all. And I think by my junior year, my advisor said, "Well, there's really not many more you can take. So what else? What else do you want to take? And maybe you should consider political science." So, so I started taking political sciences, and I really, really fell in love with political science because it also had a lot of history to it. And so there was this Catholic priest at Marquette who every summer would take about 30 Marquette students out to Washington, D.C. For a summer internship on Capitol Hill. So either working with the House or the Senate. We'd all live together. We would do some coursework while we were there. And they tried to always locate the students either in a home congressional district office or a home state Senate office. And being from Iowa, I got lucky enough to be placed in the office of Senator Tom Harkin, who was a longtime both House member and senator from Iowa. But more important, Tom chaired the subcommittee on disability policy, and that was really the engine that drove the creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I got to be an intern on the subcommittee not too long after the ADA was passed. And it was a really, really fascinating first experience into government, into public policy, into advocacy, and obviously into disability. And so it was always a special summer, or it's always a summer that stayed with me in my mind. It was, there's nothing like being 21 years old and walking into the U.S. Capitol. It's just,
I don't know if this is the right time to ask the question, or maybe once we get into the more entrepreneurial side of things, but like private sector versus public sector, both have their influences. Since you've seen both, do you have an idea of maybe what can have a greater influence on policy and the inclusivity and accessibility of businesses? Obviously, the ADA is landmark legislation, but like, is there a case that the private sector might be able to move things along at a faster pace or in a different way that that like governmental work
yes.
can't?
And I would say in today's environment, the private sector could and should and must move things along much more quickly than the public sector, shall we say, than policymakers. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, as you alluded to, the ADA is a landmark piece of legislation, right? It is, and in Tom Harkin's words, the ADA set the floor for things like accessibility, like civil rights, like accommodations. That doesn't prohibit anyone or any organization or any company from going beyond that floor and truly excelling in that floor. And I think if you look at today's hyper politicized environment, it is really hard to get almost any kind of policy through the system. You know, not only introduced, but then through all the committees, through all the floor debate, and then obviously getting it signed by the executive branch, by the president. And so it's really incumbent, I think, upon the disability movement, the allies of the disability movement, to be more proactive in pressuring the private sector to be more proactive in creating not only more inclusive workspaces, but bringing a much more inclusive, universal, accessible mindset to how they operate at every level of the organization, how they hire talent, how they, ideate and innovate products and services, how they deliver those, to how they tie it to its organizational strategy. And I think within that, and this is something that, I've written a few papers on, I believe the most influential actor right now in the marketplace when it comes to advancing the cause of, should we just say, inclusion, disability inclusion, writ large, are investors, right? So think of an investor in my mind is anything from a venture capital fund to big investment banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, to insurance companies and pension funds, all of whom invest in companies. Any good investor wants to invest in things that pay off over the long term, right? So you want to be investing in companies like Microsoft, who continue to grow market share, continue to drive profits, and they do it year after year after year, because you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, to your pensioners, whoever they may be, to return a healthy investment to them. So you don't want to be investing in companies like Enron, which famously blew up in the early 2000s because of all kinds of accounting fraud, and it was really just a vacuous company, but it looked good on paper for a little while. So investors have in their best interest a desire to invest in companies that are always growing market share, always finding new customers for their goods and services, always having good talent to innovate new and better ways of doing things, all of which plays into the hands of the disability movement. So, and investors have the credibility to walk into any C-suite of most any company in the world to say, you know what? There's a better way of doing things. There's a better, more influential lever you can pull to make your organization more innovative, more profitable, more desirable in the market. And so let us tell you about the value proposition of disability and employing more people with disability, and not just employing more people with disabilities, but recognizing the fact that 20% of your workforce at least identifies disabled. So make sure that they feel empowered every day to bring their best, most authentic selves to work, rather than spending time trying to hide their disability and cover up from their disability. Instead, empower them to unleash their disability as a way to be more creative and more productive in your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, you teed that up nicely for maybe the crux of this conversation, which is with focusing on the case studies book that you wrote, and how disability inclusion and innovation has been fundamental to the growth of and success of these companies. But I'm interested in maybe before we dive into the main content of the book, I'm really interested in the process that you took to write it. Was there a specific conversation that you had where you kind of came to this realization that disability driven innovation can be profitable and purposeful? Or was it a topic that you wanted to write about and then you found the stories to support it? Or was it a story that kind of led you to the topic?
That's a good question, and I would say it's both. So I would say my journey on this topic began 5 years ago during the pandemic. It was like exactly 5 years ago, almost, when I proposed a research paper to the Harkin Institute, which is located at Drake University. It was founded by Tom Harkin when he retired from the Senate in 2015, and so I realized in the summer of 2020 when after COVID or in the midst of COVID, after the terrible murder of George Floyd, that all these companies were making these commitments to invest more in society, to be more responsible, to do more in the communities in which they operate. And a lot of those commitments were focused around race, gender, ethnicity, religious preference, sexual orientation. Disability was not mentioned in any of those conversations. And so that's when I went to the Harkin Institute to make the case that both these this important aspect of society, the one trait that is intersectional to all of us, is completely out of the conversation, and it's in the best interest of organizations to maximize the talents of persons with disabilities. And so that started my journey. I started, wrote my first paper in the fall of 2020 for the institute, and since that time, I've been in addition to launching Value Inclusion, I've been a fellow at the institute. And so you just start coming into contact with all these amazing entrepreneurs and these innovators, and I came to realize how much they had overcome. And I know that every entrepreneur, every innovator, every owner of a business has always overcome a lot. But it goes without saying here that, the persons with disabilities who follow that journey are overcome even more barriers. It's even more challenging. I think that realization came to a head for me a couple of years ago when at the Institute we hosted what we called it was the Summit on Disability-Driven Innovation at the Harkin Institute, which is a physical building at the Des Moines campus at Drake. And we very, very intentionally created an agenda where entrepreneurs, small business owners who identified as disabled had the stage. They were there in front of corporates, investors, policymakers, and so on, talking about their journey, what worked well for them, what challenges they face, what they need to scale businesses more and more. And that really started me thinking that, again, as I said before, there's this amazing group of people out there that have persevered through so much, that have innovated their way through society to create these businesses that are enduring and lasting and add value. And so those stories need to be told. And it took me a while to kind of get my head around all of this. It took me a while to create the space to write the book. But the book, Case Studies in Disability-Driven Innovation, is designed to be one where it makes the business case for disability-driven innovation. I hope I do a good job conveying the value proposition of integrating persons with disabilities into every level of an organization in the hopes of spurring greater innovation and more creative thinking. And then using the powerful case studies of the entrepreneurs and innovators to show how it can be done. And in some cases, that's just people creating their own business as a way to self-employment because the traditional workforce wasn't for them or wasn't accommodating to them. Or it was, people seeking to really build out a full-blown company and potentially, get on the ride of venture capital and selling that and cashing out and things like that. Or it's people acting as entrepreneurs within organizations, using their creative talents to make the organization better, more innovative and access new markets. So again, the case studies, the stories were designed to, I guess, provide a bit of a finer point on some of the ways that other organizations, other people, other entrepreneurs could build on the lessons learned from others and hopefully scale their own work.
Yeah, we know the total addressable market of people with disabilities is quite large, but do you think when encouraging companies to be more inclusive and accessible, it can come solely from an economic lens, or does it also have to involve some degree of empathy?
This the strongest if you my firm belief is if you want the goal, should we just say, of greater employment to persons with disabilities at all levels of an organization to succeed and to stand the test of time, it needs to be put into the language and the mindset of any good corporate executive, which are things like profits, innovation, market access, and things like that. Obviously, empathy can play a role, but if you over index too much on empathy, it's treated as a charitable or philanthropic endeavor. And that's when it leads to, a few people being hired to work in some, narrow part of the company or the organization. And it doesn't ever really stick. And those people tend to be the first ones fired on a moment's notice at any time of economic upheaval or anything like that. So the more it can be integrated into the overall mission and strategy of the company, the better it is for the long-term viability of that initiative.
Yeah, that charity model of disability seems to be too deeply ingrained, I guess. Like it feels slimy to talk about the disability population as a source of profit, right? So like we're so accustomed to viewing organizations that support people with disabilities as charitable endeavors, and there's not many that do, for lack of a better term, capitalize on the disabled populations. So it seems it's a conversation that I have with gyms and sometimes nonprofits where they'll seek out funding or scholarship for people with disabilities to attend their programs, and that's not a sustainable model, right? And so the thing I always ask is like, why can that person not afford to attend your class, and what can you as a business do about it? I'm not going to give you a scholarship for someone to come to your gym for 8 weeks if I know that then they're not going to be able to ever attend your gym again because they can't afford it. Like that's not going to have any lasting effect on their health. And so for us at our gym here in Massachusetts, like I think when I first started my career, I was coming from the nonprofit space, heavily involved with Special Olympics and Best Buddies, and I thought I could either do good or I could make money, and the two were kind of mutually exclusive. And then I realized the better that my gym does, the more it can support maybe the people who need some financial assistance. And that's not disability driven. They don't have to have a diagnosis to access that. They need to demonstrate need. And oftentimes it's not my athletes with disabilities that do need that financial assistance. Right. It's people without. But I guess the more successful a business does, the more people it can help. That's not to say that they'll all be philanthropic and they'll all be empathetic in their decisions. But I do think to a degree it does have to come from the private sector. And I guess it just requires a different way of thinking. But
it requires a different way of thinking, but I guess I'm increasingly at a loss as to why organizations aren't embracing the value proposition of disability employment. And look, I know it's hard, right? I consult with a lot of companies who want to go on that journey and are on that journey, and I make no bones about it. Creating a more, should we just say, inclusive organization, both emotionally and physically, in a legacy company that's been around for a while, is incredibly hard. Having said that, these companies, employers of all kinds, are facing acute talent shortages. They are facing increasingly competitive markets. They are facing upheaval in the markets. They are facing increasing shareholder expectations to do a better job driving profits from those markets. So why are they sticking to the same old same old? Why don't you try something newer and better and go after a population that is proven time and time again to be really, really innovative employees, to really add to the culture of the organization, to be central to unlocking new markets, to be central to finding new ways to innovate new and better products to get to new markets. Like, again, I don't begrudge anyone the challenges in that journey, but I do begrudge organizations for at least not really thinking long and hard about it and at least trying to make that work. Because you're running out of talent, you're running out of markets. So what are you going to do? The status quo isn't going to work for the next 20, 30 years. So do something better.
For those organizations that might kind of be stuck in their ways, if they want it to become more inclusive and accessible, what is the first thing that you would recommend they do? Or kind of, yeah, I guess what would be the process of doing so? It's not going to happen overnight. So if you were consulting with them, kind of what do you think? How would you lay out those steps, I guess?
The first step we tell every organization, in particular the leadership of every organization, is to just talk about disability, right? To give people in the organization the space to, as I said before, bring their best, most authentic selves to work, right? So if you're a CEO of a company, what would you rather have? Your employees spending time and effort hiding their disability and trying to find ways to work around it, or using their disability to make the company better, right? And so if the leadership of an organization simply talks about disability, maybe they have a disability, maybe they have a connection to disability, or maybe they just want to be allies, but just add to the culture of the organization that you're all employees of the organization, all suppliers of the organization, all partners of the organization are welcome to bring their best selves to the office every day. Because without that, should we just say permission? You're never gonna achieve everything that comes after that. So the first is, again, creating the space for people to be their best selves. The second is to really, really work to build some good, strong partnerships in the communities in which you operate that can help you in that journey, that can help you source some new talent, that can help you better work with that talent. Because it is a really easy tell for me when I see organizations proclaiming a commitment to disability hiring or inclusive workplaces and they have no partnerships, right? That means immediately that it's just words on a page. It's just statements being sent out over the newswire. It's not actually real work. It's not something that's actually happening day in and day out at the company. So partnerships is really, really important. And then another thing is to, set some objectives, like challenge yourself. Just like, Brendan, the people that run your races, right? They have challenged themselves. They have set a goal for themselves. That's hard to reach that goal, right? It requires effort every day. Sometimes you may make the goal, sometimes you may exceed, sometimes you may come up short. But you challenge yourself, you put yourself out there. And so if you really want your organization to succeed in this journey, set some goals that are both realistic but also a bit challenging. And if you can live up to those goals, you will see that you've made real progress, and progress in ways that can be measured and tracked.
There feels sometimes like there's a little bit of a friction, I guess, between the nothing about us without us movement, which makes a lot of sense, right? People with disabilities need to be involved in the process. And just, I guess, my role as an ally, someone who does not identify as disabled, working on projects that exclusively revolve around disability. How can people without disabilities be better allies? and kind of what is, I know the role because we've talked a little bit about it, but like what's the role that people without disabilities can play? How can we be more supportive?
That is a really great question, because I must admit that that is something I struggle with, right? How do I identify? Am I an ally? Am I a person with a disability? I mean, it's taken me a long time to feel comfortable talking about my disability. I would, for the vast majority of my life, I would look at my disability and I would look at people with more severe physical disabilities, and I would think, well, how can I consider myself disabled when, I have full use of all my limbs? They may not be perfect, but at least I can use my limbs, right? So it's been a process, but what I have found in that process is that I've had a handful of really honest, authentic conversations with people who have encouraged me in that journey and who've helped me understand my role in this journey. And so I would say that any ally, maybe more than anything else, is someone who's just willing to be a resource, a sounding board to someone with a disability as they're making their way through a very inaccessible, oftentimes closed-minded society. And we all need that. But I think if you constantly feel closed out of society, you need it even more. And I think persons with disabilities often feel that way because, they live in a society that's not built for them.
Yeah. Do you think too often people with disabilities kind of get pigeonholed into working on almost exclusively disability oriented causes?
Yeah, I would say they get pigeonholed into either working on causes or working on tasks or in responsibilities that others think that they are suited for, rather than the tasks that they themselves, as a person with a disability, are best suited for.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example, and this is kind of what started Tom Harkin's journey to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Right? He grew up in a small town in Iowa. His older brother Frank became profoundly deaf at a young age. I think he was 3 or 4. By the time Frank became a young professional, he was told very specifically there are 3 types of jobs that he could have, and only 3. One of which was being a baker. And of those 3, Frank decided like being a baker was the one that he disliked the least, so he became a baker. He hated the job. It's not what he wanted to do. And so, long story short, through a lot of gumption on his part, Frank found his way to a manufacturing facility that made parts for jet engines, aircraft jet engines. And he was kind of hired under like the charitable guys, like this guy who owned the shop hired Frank because Frank kind of buttonholed him one day and convinced him to give him a job. And after a few weeks on the job, the owner goes to Frank's supervisor and he said, well, how's Frank Harkin doing? Is he doing okay? And the guy said, yeah, he's our best worker. Like we need more people like Frank. Well, it turns out that Frank was able to do the most precise, the most accurate work because of his deafness, because he's in the middle of this incredibly noisy, loud, very distracting machine shop floor, and Frank heard none of it. And so Frank could manufacture his parts time and time again to the exacting precision you need for a jet engine because he was able to work without being distracted. So, like, Frank found his true calling in life because someone took a chance on him and someone decided to find a job that utilized Frank's skills. And I think that's something that all of us need to learn from and better appreciate. And it's certainly something that I've really gained a better understanding of over these last few years, which is, listen listen to people, listen to what their passions are, listen to what their skill sets are. And I think, going back to our earlier conversation, there's a company in Jackson, Wyoming called Vertical Harvest that does that with its employees. And they're successful because of that, because they make the effort to find the roles that their employees are best suited for. And so when they land them in those roles, when the employees find the way to those roles, then you have like the perfect scenario, right? You have a motivated employee bringing their best self to work, using their skills and talents, all for the betterment of the organization. Like that's a win-win for everyone. And all of us need to do a better job finding those paths forward for ourselves, for others, especially, if people want to be allies in the workplace, like really, really think about how you can affect that kind of change in the workplace.
I think you see it in both the employment and the consumer data that people with disabilities tend to be more loyal to brands and companies as well. So when you look at industries that deal with a great amount of retention challenges, it could be another case for disability inclusion being a advantageous aspect as well. But I guess that's why your book's so important, right? The storytelling addresses the stigmas and the misconceptions that people have, because you could probably make the case that every jet engine manufacturer owner probably hasn't had an experience that would even put on their radar that someone who's hard of hearing would be an excellent employee, because
Right.
they've probably never heard, or they've probably never considered that scenario. So I
Right.
guess how can these messages be more amplified, or just kind of shared with the decision makers? Obviously you're playing your part, but are there other people that are also kind of advocating for this type of awareness? We are grateful for the support of our first show sponsor. Resolution Fitness offers leading brand health club equipment and accessories for residential and commercial use. In addition to traditional exercise equipment, they specialize in adaptive fitness products and wheelchair accessible machines. If you're interested in outfitting your fitness facility or home gym to be more accessible, visit www.resolutionfitness.ca or the link in the show notes below.
There are, but let me get to that. But I first want to go back to the employee retention
Yeah.
issue, because there was something that happened in the writing of the book that was a real learning for me. So one of the people that has been an ongoing source of insights for me is this guy named Steve Foresti. He's the former chief investment officer of Wilshire Associates, which is one of the investors that we talked about before. It's an asset management firm located near Los Angeles, California. And Steve has Stargardt's disease, so he has virtually no vision. He can see a little bit of peripherally, but he's, for all intents and purposes, Steve is blind. Steve, as I mentioned before, became the chief investment officer of this very large, very prominent investment firm. So Steve was responsible for managing hundreds of millions of dollars of money. Obviously, Steve was very successful in that. But Steve talked about one of our conversations earlier in his career when he was being recruited to go to another firm, and he chose not to, in part because he liked his job, he liked where he was, but it also would have required upending his routine, right? Because being blind, he had to have a very, very specific routine of how he got to the office. When he got to the office, this is how he conducted his business, then how he got home. So, he makes the point that persons with disabilities oftentimes are seemingly loyal because they are more comfortable with the routine than they are comfortable with the job. And I think that's something that again, all of us should keep in mind is don't just take the loyalty of your employees with disabilities for granted. Don't just take it as a sign they love everything about their position or the organization. Make sure that you, like you would with any other employee, are taking the time to really understand their motivations for being in the job. And that requires a constant dialogue. So, I just wanted to flag that as don't ever take the loyalty for granted.
But it probably makes the case too, the more accommodating you can be and the more attention to detail you provide, the more immersed they're going to become in the business. Not the more stuck they're going to become, but the more comfortable they'll be in that routine, and the more likely they'll not feel like the grass is greener on the other side because I can go find a better situation. Like if you build the ideal routine for that person, then they're going to be even more likely to stay, I guess.
Exactly. And that's no different than any other employee, right? You want them to feel that they're welcome, they're part of the team, that they're accommodated, right? Like maybe they need to leave early to pick up kids from school or something like that. So, you know, provide a person with disability with all the exact same abilities to integrate themselves into the organization as you would to anyone else. And that's, at the end of the day, I think that's all anyone wants. But to go back to the question of, you know, how to amplify the message, spread the word. Obviously, podcasts like this are incredibly important. I mean, just look at look at the people you've had on this podcast. I mean, it's amazing the diversity of people you've had on this podcast and the audience that you're reaching through it. More of that is needed. More storytelling is needed. More engagement is needed. But I think that there are two bigger, harder recommendations that I would make that would really help convey the story. And the first is more data needs to be collected to make the business case for the value proposition of disability employment. Right? You cannot, in fairness to an investor or a corporate executive, you can't just walk into their office and say, hey, you know, I bet you it'd be really good if we hired a lot of people with disabilities. We hired them at all levels of the company. I mean, if your job is to run the company, like you can't operate on hunches, you can't operate on whims. So you need some good arguments to make decisions like that. So the more data that we can collect to show the business case conclusively, the value around the value proposition of disability employment, the better the arguments are and the better the outcomes will be. And the second is, and I, you know, kind of put this down as a challenge to everyone, including myself, is we have to take these conversations beyond the disability community. We have to go to places where corporate executives are, where more policymakers are, where more investors are, and be more confident in describing the value proposition of disability employment. Because it's like any, and this is where network science comes in, right? It's how networks work. If you keep talking to the same people, you're ultimately talking to a closed network, and all you're doing is reinforcing each other's thoughts. You need to get into the looser networks of new people, new organizations, and where new ideas are floating around. If you really want to foster change, if you really want to foster new ways of doing things, and that's hard. But that means, again, going in front of different sets of audiences that don't always have the clear connection to disability. But being creative to find ways to have the conversation of disability in front of those new audiences at those different venues is incredibly important. Otherwise, it's the same people telling the same story to the same audiences, and that doesn't foster fundamental transformative change. You have to broaden the network of people that are hearing the message, that are being allies, and that are on the front lines with you of trying to change how we operate as a society.
Yeah. I was gonna say that's kind of where the role of allies probably comes in,
And that's
maybe
a great point.
in the most pronounced manner for sure.
Great point. That's a real, like, allies can really help in that regard.
Yeah, facilitate some of those connections. Was there a specific story when interviewing or conversing with people for the book that kind of stood out to you and maybe fundamentally shifted something that you believed?
I would say that the story that still sticks out with me is the second story in the book. It's about this guy named Michael Zal, who's launched this really cool company called Yellowbird. And what it essentially is, it's a virtual health and safety company where you can do get online assessments of your health, environmental health and safety practices. And it's, although it was not created with persons with disabilities in mind, it's ideally suited to employing persons with disabilities because all this work can be done virtually and through technology. And it can be done on flexible schedules. But Michael was born with 2 disabilities. He was born with spina bifida, and he was born without a fully developed right arm. And Michael talked about how when he was a young kid, at the playgrounds at school, getting picked on, and kids would mimic having their arms amputated and, pick on little Mikey. And time again, Mike had to go back to school the next day in front of all that abuse. And he had to suffer through it again and again and again. And he persevered. And it's that lesson in perseverance that has given him the fortitude to stick with Yellowbird through some really tough times. And, he's had some great ups, but he's also had some tough downs. And so he is able to persevere through being told by investors no time and time again. He's had to take money out of his own retirement to meet payroll. And yet he goes back to school again the next day. And it just really, the rawness of that story really hit home to me. The rawness of how hard this is hit home. But also how many persons with disabilities have this really unique ability to persevere through incredibly hard times. And that is something that a lot of entrepreneurs lack. And it's something that many people with disabilities have in spades. And I really just started more, after talking with Michael, I really started listening more and being more and more taken with each time the stories of that perseverance than I had been before. And I came to realize that it's, these best entrepreneurs, disabled or not, aren't always the most brilliant people. They're not the perfect person. The man, they know how to get up and go to school the next day when they've been picked on. Yeah. And when they've been told no, and when their product fails, and when their employees walk out. And so it's just a life lesson for all of us. And it really made talking to more entrepreneurs after that conversation a lot richer and a lot different for me.
I don't have a well-formulated thought, but with a 1 and a 3-year-old, I think a lot about how I can influence kids to be more kind. And I don't say that in a way like I'm going to have some huge, large influence on kids, but I see in the microcosm of my gym, some of my athletes, clients without disabilities who now hang around after their workout and help out some of, for lack of a better term, adaptive athletes. We'll just use those as differentiating terms, hang around after and help them with their workouts. And I think it carries beyond the walls of the gym as well. And I think it carries over to school as well. But that story of Michael getting picked on, it's probably the thing that racks my brain the most is just the landscape of bullying and kindness and just how to influence it in a different way. It seems to be becoming more rampant and more of an issue, and I'm not sure exactly how it gets addressed, but I think in my small little community, and that's where sometimes just even with the political landscape, it becomes overwhelming. I can only control what I can control, which is the environment that I'm in right here. Sometimes it feels futile, but I guess it's the only thing I can really influence.
But I think that those are some great points, though. I mean, we all have it in us to be a bully. We all have it in us to be kind. And we can control what we do in every situation. And so those people at the gym, right, they can pick on, or they can make some of the adaptive athletes feel very uncomfortable in the gym setting, or they can stay behind and help them through a workout. And so it's one of those times in life, one of those times in the world, we should probably spend a little bit more time being a bit more introspective and thinking about how we can harness that kindness that's in all of us and bring that out and push the bully part of us down and away from ever coming out. And
Yeah.
hopefully that's, something that all of us can challenge to do, because we can control that. I mean, that's a fact. We can
Yeah.
control that.
You were talking about, before I digressed, you were talking about the technological innovations that sometimes disability necessitates. And obviously a hot topic is artificial intelligence and AI tools. And I think it's funny, just anecdotally, as a small business owner, you have to wear a lot of hats, right? So I had to build a website. I had to do all these things. I didn't outsource those things because they're expensive. And as a small business, your margins are thin. So I tried to learn it on my own. And then you hear, digital accessibility lawsuits, and you have all these different things, and people in my network that are shouting that they like that all these people are non-compliant when it comes to digital accessibility standards, and how could they? And I just know from my own experience, like it's hard to wear all these hats, it's hard to do all these things, but I know some of the AI accessibility tools fall short. What role, I guess, can AI play maybe in improving the lives of people with disabilities, and maybe what are also the barriers or where it falls short?
AI, like any good technology, is a double-edged sword, right? So it has the opportunity, as we have seen, to expedite, to make more efficient how we do, seemingly routine tasks. It also, though, has a lot of pitfalls, particularly for persons with disabilities. One of which I touched on in the book, where the tools aren't terribly sensitive to the nuance of disability. So one day I just randomly found one of the free AI platforms that generates visual images, right? And so I asked it to create an image of me, for me, of a blind person walking down the street. And that was all that I specified. So the image that came back in a matter of seconds was this very disheveled, older white male with, kind of unkept hair. He had these really, really big black glasses on. His clothes looked pretty unkept. And he was using two wooden canes, right? The old fashioned curved handle wooden canes, right? So when you ask AI to describe a blind person, that's what you get. And I mean, I don't know how many stereotypes that checks off in the box, but it's a lot of stereotypes, right? So I then asked it again. I said, I gave it a more nuanced, more sophisticated prompt of, depict someone who was wearing stylish glasses, is well dressed, is biracial, and is using a white cane. And I actually described the white cane that many people who are blind or visually impaired use. And so it came back with a much better image of a person who's blind, but it never correctly conveyed the white cane. It still was using the old wooden cane, and the pictures of both are in the book. So that to me really hit home that the disability community needs to much more actively engage with these platforms to help the platforms, help them, the owners of the platforms, the developers of these platforms really understand the nuance of disability. Because if it's missing those kinds of nuances, it's not going to be as a good of a resource as it could be to persons with disabilities. And I also think, the more that organizations rely on AI powered tools to, screen job candidates or develop job postings, the more risk there is that the nuance of disability, the nuance around accommodations is just going to get ignored, or it's going to be, frankly, a red flag that's going to be used to kick people out of being considered for jobs or promoted for jobs. And so it's going to be really, really important for the disability community, for the allies, to stay on top of things like that, to make sure that these AI tools are as inclusive, as knowledgeable, and as effective as possible. And right now, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to meet those objectives.
You say in the book, I'll just maybe quote it, we must accept that our mindset about how the economy functions is what prevents disability-driven innovation from scaling. I believe we are at a tipping point. Would you be able to elaborate on kind of what that tipping point is and maybe what needs to happen to have an impact on it?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, we're in this moment in the history, I think, where we are confronted with countless systemic challenges: climate change, poverty, resource scarcity, inequality, and so on. And obviously, the status quo that has brought us to this point in time is not going to serve us well going forward. It is only going to make those challenges worse rather than better. There's really nothing in the status quo that gives me comfort that those big challenges that frankly determine the future course of society are going to get solved. So we need more good innovation more than ever before. Having said that, we don't necessarily lack for innovation. We don't lack for good ideas. What we lack for is the infrastructure to bring those ideas forward. And by infrastructure, I mean investment money, collaboration, mentoring, peer support, corporate organizational culture, all those things that allow innovation to flourish, that allow good ideas to be brought into a market. And so we're either going to build that infrastructure in the very, very near future, and we're going to push through these challenges, and we're going to start solving the challenges, or we're going to kind of retreat and pull back, and we're going to allow these challenges to overwhelm us to the detriment of our futures. And so, as I hope the book showed time and time again, the mindset behind disability-driven innovation is uniquely suited for this moment, right? Finding creative ways to innovate through some of the most challenging, complex problems facing us. Are we going to allow ourselves to foster that kind of innovation, or are we going to allow ourselves to be caught up again in the status quo, a very closed, reactive mindset that's going to hinder that kind of innovation? And like we touched on before, we're at that fork in the road moment. I mean, we really are. So it's on us to choose how we move forward.
Since I like to tie this to health, fitness, fitness industry as a whole, what do you think gyms could do to become more inclusive and accessible?
I think do what you're doing, which is most important: creating a space where everyone feels welcome, everyone feels comfortable. As I've said time and time again, like bringing their best, most authentic selves to work, right, or to the gym, and just creating a culture where people feel comfortable showing up, no matter where they are in the journey in physical activity, no matter what their goals or what their objectives are. But that culture where people are willing to stay behind to help others achieve their goals is a wonderful culture. And if we could take that out of a gym and spread that mindset, that sense of purpose across society, we'd be so much better off. So, it goes without saying how important physical activity is for all of us, both mentally and physically. And when times are tough, you have to find ways to sustain yourself. You have to find ways to stay healthy. Otherwise, you're not going to endure when it's tough. So I see gyms as the one of the important foundational components to allowing us to get through these tough times. So if more and more gyms can be these hubs of belonging and cooperation and collegiality, I think that would just do wonders across all aspects of society. And you don't really turn anyone away from the gym. You found ways to use the revenue model of the gym to keep the doors open for anyone. And I just wish all of us would do a better job keeping our door, no matter what it is, open for more people.
I think one of the challenges, and I don't have a great answer for it, is people with disabilities, maybe physical disabilities that require a little bit more assistance in a place like a gym, are often relegated to one-to-one personal training, which carries a higher price tag. And then that makes it socioeconomically inaccessible. And we've solved the problem with a relatively unique model where we have a lot of university interns who are getting college credit, so they're not on payroll. And we're able to, like I mentioned before, kind of leverage some of our members as volunteers and kind of providing those extra hands where needed. And we're able to offer pretty close to personal training at a relatively inexpensive price point. But I've kind of run into different gym models and that not working in different gym models. And I'm not sure exactly how to address the socioeconomic barrier. And you maybe see it with adaptive sport technology as well. When it requires more individualization, it requires more customization, the price point ends up being higher, and it gets hard to scale it and lower it. But I know price point's going to be a barrier, and I don't have a solution to it yet. But I think that's kind of the next big thing I think I have to address. We've worked hard to address the education piece and the stigmas and the misconception piece, and now we have a way of educating fitness professionals about disability inclusion. But the business side, the socioeconomic barriers is something that still persists.
I think that the socioeconomic realities are pervasive across the disability movement, and that's a really, really unfortunate reality. And I don't have any answers for that. I'll admit candidly that it's been a lot harder to build a consultancy around the value proposition of disability inclusion as it has been to build my previous consultancy around, corporate advisory practices when it comes to sustainability, responsible supply chains, and things like that. Having said that, though, I'm just taken by the approach that you're taking, Brendan, of being so creative and just trying all these different solutions, all these different pathways to addressing those socioeconomic challenges. And I think that, again, is what always impresses me so much about disability driven innovation, that it's just this can do attitude. If one door closes, find another door, open up that door, go through that door, keep going, keep going. And it just, the thought process of, okay, well, we can't offer a salary to trainers, so maybe we can offer course credit. It's just like in the end, that kind of mindset just it pays off. It pays off for you. It pays off for your customers and the clientele of the gym. And the gym is just one example of that. And so I guess that, despite all these challenges, it's that kind of mindset that gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, I don't always like the term entrepreneur. At least I don't really label myself as an entrepreneur, but I do really like the problem solving aspect of, I guess, what you would call entrepreneurship, and the different projects I get to work on. They're all really fulfilling, and it's nice to have different things. There's always something that's engaging to work on. And I think I've just always felt a sense of stewardship, and I hope that my work makes someone else's life a little bit better.
It is. It has.
So,
I mean, that's a fact, Brandon. I mean, you have. I mean, the world. So. When you leave the world, it will be better than when you first started. So maybe, because of the mindset that you're bringing to this, and that's so important.
Yeah, and it'll be better from the people that I was able to engage with over my career. So
just look at all the people in your races. Look at all the people that walk through the gym. Everyone's better because of that.
Yeah.
Kudos to you for that.
Yeah. Well, we'll try to drive listeners to your book. I garnered a ton of value from it. It was kind of it was a little bit of confirmation bias because, like I shared with you, I was kind of working on a similar paper resource that's almost exclusively to the fitness industry. Because, like I said before, I want to encourage more gyms to be more inclusive, and I think you alluded to it before, where it's like you can't view disability inclusion as a charitable endeavor because it's going to be the first thing to go when there's a more profitable avenue or something that could replace it, or when it's not really generating the returns that it needs to. So we need to encourage gyms to view disability inclusion as a part of their business, not necessarily a sacrifice. So I would encourage gym owners, case studies and disability driven innovation to be a part of, I guess, their learning process, because I think it really does make a lot of cases for how disability should be included within any industry. So I commend you and thank you for writing it, because now it's just a resource that I can direct people to instead of try to explain it.
That's awesome. And to Brendan, to you, to any of the listeners out there, always happy to do book signings at gyms, at races, anywhere that's fun and nice. Provides a sense of community. I'm happy to be there. So,
are you in Iowa, or are you back in the Milwaukee?
I live in the Washington, D.C. area, so I live in Northern Virginia.
Okay, cool.
But get to Iowa a few times a year.
Yeah. So. Well, I'm just trying to map out my next unified 5K locations. So I've only talked to a couple of people in the DC area, but maybe we'll get one down that way.
That would be a good one. Iowa, actually, there's a really strong running culture in Iowa, and as one who's tried to organize races here, it is, at least where I live, it is so dense, because I live just across. I live in Alexandria, so I'm just across the river. Yeah. It is the population density here is actually greater now than in DC. Mm-hmm. Iowa, on the other hand, like there's a lot more freedom and flexibility.
There is, yeah. You think that you would want to be in a densely populated area, but I've actually learned that kind of the more suburban, less restrictions, less permitting, less all these factors that make things a headache. So, and I think for me personally, like I would much rather drive an hour and run in like not a city versus I'm in Massachusetts, so drive into Boston and worry about traffic, worry about parking, worry about all these other variables. So yeah, we're definitely trending towards the suburban areas. But so if people want to learn more about your work, access your resources, we can include the direct links in the show notes. But where would you suggest that they find you?
The best place to find me is on our Value Inclusion website. So that's just valueinclusion.com. Or you can always go to my own consulting website, which is Ludke, Ludke, consulting.com.
Okay, awesome.
And then Bob, there's the Harkin Institute also is a good resource for a lot of things related to Senator Harkin's career. There's a page on the Institute regarding my work around the value proposition of disability. But if you just search for the Harkin Institute, it will come right up.
Awesome. Appreciate you taking the time and looking forward to sharing this with our audience.
It's truly been my pleasure. Thank you, Brendan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.